Well, here we are at the last video of the week and very likely the last video of the year. And the main point of this one is to review for test number 4. It is officially scheduled for next Thursday, May 7th, and there is nothing else scheduled that night. There will be no new material or anything else that comes up that night. You can do the test basically whenever it's convenient for you during the week. It'll be available about Monday, and you can take it anytime up through Friday of next week. You do need to make sure that you've got it done no later than Friday night, May 8th. Also due next week is your project summary. And I'll talk a little bit at the end about exactly what needs to happen with your summary, but you do need to make sure that we get that in also. Like everything we've done in the second half of the semester, this will be online, and the format will be fairly similar to what you had for Test 3. There are a couple of exceptions to that in that there's a couple of questions where you do actually have to write out an answer rather than having the short answer or multiple choice that everything was on Test 3. Just like you did for the quizzes the past couple of weeks, you will need to email me to get a link for the test. And once you have it, you need to take that and it'll be submitted automatically. A few other quick things about the test. It is not really a cumulative test, although things like the which test should I use do go back and cover all of the stuff that we've talked about this semester. But it really is over what we've done since Test 3. Notes are allowed. There's not really any way for that not to happen in the setting that you have online. So yes, you may use notes with it, and there's no set time that you have to do other than when the ultimate deadline is. You'll get a computer auto score, but for a number of reasons it will not be accurate. Like has happened with a lot of the things I have, many of the questions will be worth half a point rather than one, and so the points will end up being adjusted usually upward. Also, the computer can't score the things that I have you actually write out, and so obviously I'll have to go back and give you credit for those. I'll plan on posting those as quickly as I can, and if you're interested, I can actually email you the original test once everybody is finished. As has been true with all of the tests that you've done, there is a sample test online that's in Canvas, and I do suggest that you do look through that. This obviously is a paper and pencil test rather than written to be done online, but the idea of what you're doing is very similar to what you will see on your test. The questions are in kind of a different order from what you're going to see for your actual test. That's largely because I pieced this together from about 4 different places, and so some things that were kind of tacked on to the end that were in reality in the middle when we learned them. So there are 6 main topics that we have gone through since we took the third test, and I want to talk about all of those briefly, although I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail on these because going through the sample test really is the best way to review. We're going to start with the first topic, which is correlation and regression. You want to know that all a correlation is just a relationship between 2 variables. You also want to know that if there is a correlation, it does not necessarily mean that the first one causes the second. It just means there's a relationship, but something else could be affecting both of them. You want to be able to look at different situations and tell whether something is a positive, negative, or no correlation problem. You had a question on your quiz where it said, for example, if you looked at the temperature outside and how much people spend to heat their home, is that a positive, negative, or no correlation? That is most likely to be a negative correlation. And the reason why is as the temperature goes up, your heating bill goes down. That's exactly what's happened through the month of April here. The temperature's risen and you use your heat less and less. You want to be able to interpret scatter plots. You had a whole bunch of those on last week's quiz where it was asking you, are these positive or negative? What's the strongest of these? What would end up being an appropriate number for R? So you want to be able to look at scatter plots and answer questions like those. Given some data, you do want to be able to use your calculator to calculate R. Remember, that's where you put numbers in L1 and L2, and then you want to go to Stat, Calc, and number 4, Linear Regression, and one of your choices should be R. You do want to be able to tell whether a correlation is significant. To do that, you take the R you calculated, or sometimes one that's given in the problem, and you compare it to a number in the table. Now, the table that you would use for R will come up on the test itself as just an inserted photo so that you don't need to worry about shuffling paper. But you do want to be able to look up a critical value there. And remember, for an R test, the big thing is that the calculated value has to be more than the table. Also with R, we talked about coefficient of determination. That was what percent of the change in one thing was due to the other, or could be predicted from the other. And what it was the number R squared. You literally take it times itself, so R squared. Finally, we used regression equations. Those were basically lines that you were using to predict y given x. And you'll be given a couple of situations where you're going to do exactly that. Again, you can look at examples of all those things on the sample test, and you want to be able to do some of each of those types of problems on the test itself. So the second topic we got to, number 2, was chi-square tests. You learned about that last week, and you probably just got done taking a quiz over that this week. You will for sure have to do 1 or 2 matrix chi-square tests on your actual test. Those are the ones where you're given information in a table. You need to go into matrix mode on your calculator and put those numbers in. And then you go to tests and choose chi-square test, and your answer is going to give you a p-value that you compare to get your final result. There'll also be a couple of problems that involve categorical chi-square tests, the ones where you had like a list of different amounts in categories. There are 3 things you have to do with those. You don't have to do the actual test, but you do need to do some parts of it. You need to be able to answer the question, how many degrees of freedom are there? And again, that's always 1 less than the number of categories. If you had like 10 categories, there would be 9 degrees of freedom. You want to be able to find the expected values for each of the categories. The way that you do that, typically they will give you a set of percentages that go with each of those, and you just take each of the percents times the total in your group. And finally, if I end up giving you an overall p-value, you want to be able to determine, is this a significant result? Just like every other p-value problem, if p is less than the level of significance, it's yes. If it's more, it's no. Again, I'll give you the p-value. You don't need to actually calculate it, but you do need to be able to say yes or no, is this significant? Number 3 on the list of topics is non-parametric statistics. And if you jump straight to this without watching the earlier videos, you definitely will want to go back to the very first one and make sure that you do know all about non-parametric statistics. So with non-parametric statistics, I'm first of all going to ask you a couple of questions about the advantages and disadvantages of those. If I were doing those, I'd probably say the advantages are things like they're quick and easy, and you don't make any special assumptions about the population. Biggest disadvantage is that you don't have a specific number you can compare with other things. The 2 non-parametric tests we learned about were the sign test and runs test. Both of those involved looking up numbers in tables again, and just like with the R test, you'll have those tables inserted in your exam so you don't have to shuffle paper around while you're working with stuff. For both of those, you had to divide up your data into two groups. When you did a sign test, the way you did it is you wanted your smaller group to be less than the number you looked up in the table. For a runs test, you used the two groups to find what we called a critical range, two different numbers. And if you had random data, then your number of runs, or like blocks of data that repeated somehow, that always ended up being somewhere in that range. If it was either too big or too small, then it was not random data. And again, you'll have a couple of each of those types of tests that you need to do. So number 4 on the list is which test should I use? And this is going to be a whole bunch of multiple choice questions, exactly like what we went through earlier. And you're going to be given a situation. It'll give you 4 different types of tests. You want to look for those key giveaways, like if it says, something like if one thing goes up, then another goes up, that's a correlation R test. If it has percents in it, it's probably one of the tests about proportion. And you choose the correct test for each of those ones. There's probably about a dozen of those that you'll need to do for your exam. We just got done talking about number 5, which was what else is there. Those were those other topics that come up in statistics that we didn't really go into any detail in this class. And again, what's going to happen is you will be asked to pick either 2 or 3 of those and write a sentence or two that tells me just what it's about. This is one of those things I need to grade myself, that the computer is just going to tell you did wrong because there's not really a correct answer it can recognize. But I will go back and make sure that, yeah, you have the right idea for each of those. It's typically just a couple of words I'm looking for what's right on it. Again, it's things like if it were like Spearman's are, it involves rankings. And finally, the last thing on there is your project. Now, this year, the point of this question will be a little bit different than it usually is. Honestly, for pretty much all of you, this is going to be some easy built-in points. Usually, I put this question on here because when I have people that work in groups, sometimes you can tell that there's somebody that did all the work and somebody else that was just sort of along for the ride. And when they get to having to talk about their project on their test, they have no clue what it was about. You guys, if you've done your project, you should be able to do this very easily. What I have here, I copied directly from the sample test, and you'll have pretty much the same thing that's on your real test. It says, consider the project you did for this class, briefly answer these questions. And I ask, what question did you attempt to answer? How did you go about gathering your data? What tests did you perform in your data? What were the results? And what problems did you encounter that might have affected your results? The first 4 of those are the important part of that. You don't need to give me any specific numbers, although sometimes people know those fairly easily anyway, but you just need to tell me what you did and what result you ended up getting. Now, I put this on here because you also will need to turn in, of course, an official summary of what you did for your project separately. And when you do that, you're essentially going to answer the exact same stuff, just in more detail. There, you do want to tell me the actual numbers. Tell me exactly how much how big your sample was, and exactly what the averages or standard deviations or percents were. When you did the test, what exactly were the numbers that you got? It's the same basic stuff. I just want to know the numbers there. Here, it's just a quick summary to make sure you know what's going on with it. The project summary, by the way, the easiest thing to do is just present that as like an email that you send to me. If you've got it like done up in Word or Google Docs or whatever, you can attach that to an email and send it that way. That's going to be the most efficient way since we're not meeting in the classroom to present things this year. So again, for your test, you want to know about correlation, chi-square, non-parametric stats like sign test and runs test. You want to know those questions about which test should I use, be able to pick a couple of the other things that come up in stats and just tell me a sentence or so about what they are, and then give me a quick summary about what your project was. And that really is it for this week. That's what you need to know for the test. I do strongly suggest that you take a look at the sample test and go through, make sure that, yeah, you agree with all the answers that are on there. If you do run into any questions, shoot me an email and I'll try and get you on the right track with things. It's been an interesting semester, but hopefully you guys have gotten some good stuff out of the class, and I do wish you all well both on the test and in the future.